You know what's fun? Making a video, and then while you finish up that video, you suddenly hear about a bunch of changes coming to things related to the video. That is what happened yesterday with Heimdall. Heimdall got some new nerfs on PTS, or after PTS now, that will be on the live client, and I kind of weaved some of them into the video a little bit while discussing things and just adding some text on top of the video, but that made it a little bit complicated and everything. So I wanted to talk a little bit about those separately, but more importantly, there are also additional nerfs to Heimdall that have been announced now, and they are quite massive. This is huge. This is, in terms of damage output, this is drastic compared to what his initial damage was. So we're going to look at that, and we're also going to talk a little bit more about his roles, his positions in Conquest, because they might kind of be impacted by these changes in one way or another. So that's something worth debating again in that regard. And with that, let's get started with the nerfs that he got. The first one is the 1. This had a damage reduction of the scaling, specifically, of the sword from 105% to 95%. I said before that I think this ability isn't completely insane. Looking at, for example, Chernobog, his ability, his main damaging ability, does a lot more damage. And the ability is also relatively slow and relatively predictable. So much like the rest of his kit, you have a decent amount of time to react, to avoid it, and he has to aim very well in order to actually hit that on you. While on the other hand, as a clearing tool, it's very effective in any regard. I think the nerf from 105% to 95% was fine, was a good idea, but I also don't think it needs to be nerfed much further. It remains as a strong poking tool and additional damage output in a trade, but it's not completely overwhelming in my eyes at this point. His second ability so far did not see any further changes. We will see if the 5th tick remains on it, because there are also bug fixes that were not specifically detailed, or if the 5th tick is actually intended as well. The third ability received a lot of tweaks, primarily a lot of adjustments. The internal cooldown was already increased a while ago, but it was announced again that it's now at 1.25 seconds, so you can't just spam the crystals for attack cancelling. And additionally, the ability will now no longer activate Hydra's Lament, which was to be expected, because otherwise you could just get cleave attacks with amplified damage for 40 mana, and that works very well in tandem with Hydra's, which gives you MP5 anyways. So in that regard, I'm glad I didn't do excessive amounts of testing with that, because I was expecting these nerfs to come out, and I know that some of you were very excited about this, but really it was a super abusable mechanic and it wasn't really meant to be used that way, and Hydra's is not meant to be used that way. Additionally, you don't have to step out of the crystal after placing it in front of your under you now. It's not quite clear how close to you can place it now. Ponpon didn't really specify that, but he said that you don't have to step out after placing it, so you can basically just immediately teleport when you put it down. I hope this mechanic is intended and functioning that way now, and this is not a misunderstanding from Ponpon of my question. So not 100% sure on that one, but 95%. This is what it should be. The ability also remains unaffected by cooldown reduction, which is intended. I'm guessing that has a lot to do with the potential to rush CDR in solo lane and just use the teleport over and over for a free teleport to lane. So far, good changes, nothing that I would be critical of or that would upset anyone. And now we get to the big stuff. So it was announced yesterday by Ponpon that the wall hit on the ultimate is decreased from 45% to 30%. And behind that, he wrote in brackets, minus 30% on the total scaling of the ultimate. And at first I thought, hey, it's just 30%. That's actually not very much, because the ability still has insane base damage and scaling. So this is probably going to see more nerfs. But then I realized, hang on a second, something doesn't add up here. He actually has 3 instances of wall hit, and if you reduce each of them by 15%, that would be minus 45% damage and not minus 30%. So what's going on there? And I asked Ponpon about this, and he said there should only be 2 instances of the wall break, not 3, and asked me to provide him with a video of that. And I showed him that in PTS it's in fact 3 instances, and this has been the case throughout our versions of PTS at least. Often Hi-Rez has a more advanced internal version where that's no longer the case, where things like that are already fixed. I don't know if that was the case, but he talked to the team, or he talked to the people that were working on that, and he said to me that this is at least now fixed internally. I don't know if it was fixed before already or it's fixed on grounds of this, but that means that he will only have 2 wall breaks on the live client, and that means a significant damage reduction. Furthermore, Ponpon stated they will currently still keep the nerfed scaling of -15% per instance, as it is something he could probably still use adjusted given his follow-up of it. And I honestly think that is a good decision, but some of you may be very upset about the amount of damage that he loses this way. I think the ultimate was just too insane for what it can do very easily, and now it is, in my opinion, in a healthier place, and if it turns out to be too weak at this point, it can still be tweaked up again, but I honestly don't think it will. Depending on the protections of the target and on your own penetration, I think the damage of this will be somewhere around a similar area of Sir Cat's ultimate now, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a fair amount for this ability. And I can tell you the exact values of this as well. Before the nerfs, we had a base damage of 510 on the initial hit, and that had 110% scaling. We had 3 ticks with 65 damage each and 15% scaling, and we had 3 wall hits with 195 damage each and 45% scaling. That was a total of 1290 damage and 290% scaling. Now the values that change here are the damage for the wall hit, because the scaling goes down to 0.3 or 30%, and the ticks of the wall hit also go down to 2 ticks. And that means our total damage is now 1095 and our total scaling is 215%. In other words, we lose 195 scaling, roughly 200 scaling loss, that's quite a fair bit, and we also lose 75% scaling. That means, depending on your exact power and how many power items you build, you can roughly lose around 400-500 damage of the ability in late game before penetration, so whatever, 350 after against most targets. And still, despite those numbers, that may not be the nerf that affected him the most, because there's one more nerf, and that is the scaling of his cleave basic attacks. Previously, the main attack scaled for 130% with a 1.3 swing time as well, and the side attacks scaled for 50% or half of that. Now these cleave attacks will only deal 33% of the damage, and that will significantly impact his lane clear, because in many situations the cleave is his main lane clear. There are situations where his 2 can be the main lane clear if you can go risky enough for that, and there are situations where the 1 will also have a drastic impact on the lane clear at least, but the main tool for most of the lane damage, especially in early stages, definitely comes from the basics, comes from the cleaves. And this is why I wanted to talk a little bit about his roles. Because before, his lane clear was very strong still. It just had so many different options. You could always go for the cleave, you could always go for the 2 if that worked, or go for the 1, and you would basically at any point have sufficient clear to keep up with pretty much any other ADC or even outclear them. And I don't think that's necessarily the case now. I still think he's going to be strong at clearing in most situations, but I do think that this cleave reduction makes it so that other hunters can keep up better at least. And that can also become an issue for Heimdall from the perspective that if he uses his clearing tools very quickly, then his boxing potential can be very limited. At least in duo. But in other lanes, that's maybe less of an issue. In mid, mages often use their main damaging tools for clear relatively quickly, and you will often end up in a situation where after the wave, both mages don't have their cooldowns back up, and if you throw Heimdall in there, he still has his basics that chunk pretty well, and he can kind of keep up, and I think even with the cleave nerfs, he will still be okay in that regard. Again, he's maybe not the best clearing guard at that point, but he's still gonna be decent enough, and he's got a few interesting utilities. The problem mid for him is definitely the lack of a proper quick escape. Likewise, especially if you're considering to play him in a more bruiser style, I definitely think there's room for him to be played in solo as well. He does make use of items like Berserker's Shield 2, though they are not necessarily the best items for him, but they can kind of like bridge the gap a little bit for him and give him some more impact in earlier stages of the game until he can kind of survive on his own. The range cleave will ensure that he stays potent enough here is able to poke out enemies to some extent while also being able to clear even if he gets pressured at any point. And there's not that much harm for him in sitting close to his own tower in solo anyways. It's a bit of a boring playstyle, but it would be relatively effective for Heimdall if your main goal is just to get farmed up anyways. Which it probably should be based on the fact that Heimdall's scalings are still pretty nice. And last but not least, there is most definitely still an argument to be made for jungle. I really like his Finn in jungle, and the cleave damage loss is significantly less impactful in jungle, because what you're typically going to do in jungle is you're going to use one of your abilities to clear, and at that point the small minions will still die. If you use some basics with cleaves and you're 1, then the small minions just automatically die if you focus your basic attacks on the big minion. I also still like the fact that jungle and solo both open up the potential for him to go into more bruiser items, which seem to be relatively effective, especially now that his scalings are reduced, so going full power is probably not as impactful anymore. And the fact that you can go into Blink, because Blink is just a fantastic item that really supplements his kit and the aggressive playstyle that you can have when you're going for those close range damaging tools. In solo or on middle as well, you make a little bit more use of the vision tools that he has, which I think can be very effective, but you have to utilize them properly. You have to be aware on how to effectively use them at any point. And in jungle, you can make a little bit more use of the mobility tools for unexpected ganks or for unexpected invades. I unfortunately cannot test the new values that he has on PTS because PTS simply hasn't been up since these changes, and I don't think it will be up anymore, which is also part of the reason why I'm not using Heimdall footage today, because I want to keep that for the upcoming videos. I don't have that much. So I can't say for sure which role will feel best now. I do think most people will initially definitely play him in ADC and try him in dual lane first, but if that's the place he ends up in long term, I'm not 100% sure about it. Or rather, if you do that, you might want to have a more typical mage ADC or something in middle lane, or a normal ADC to offset that a little bit. And we'll see if that will be possible in the next season with the meta changes anyways. And that's it for today. Next time we're going to talk about Heimdall's nemesis a little bit. And we're also going to talk about Heimdall more in the future. I have quite a few videos for him still coming up, closer to his release now. And if you want to stay updated on those, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell. It really helps me out. Other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out.